Liz Shepard has not responded and explained anything more about the mistake. I think we've gotten all of the information we're going to get, and probably we're not going to find out anything more, but it is certainly interesting that that Liz is sanctioned by Twitter, an establishment DNC Democrat, proud of such on her profile. Now, these connections, though, are many. I don't think we have any idea how many of these people are inside of Facebook and Twitter and Google. Occasionally, one of these things reaches the attention of the press. So we've seen several other examples. Could you put up the next screenshot? So here we have Nick Pasilio, who is at communications at Twitter. That means he is basically at Twitter comms, whereas Liz Shepard is at Facebook comms having something to do with decision-making power over what is and is not tolerated on the platform. And he is a former Kamala Harris press secretary. Isn't that interesting? All right, next screenshot, Zach. All right, now we have, can you read his name? I can't see it. It's Monjes.
Carlos Monje?
Carlos Monjes.
Monje. Yes.
Carlos Monje is, he was at Twitter. He has now moved on to Biden's transition team. Seems a little premature to me, but nonetheless, he's moved on to Biden's transition team. So in any case, there are these connections. We don't know how many of them there are, and we don't know what the interaction between these partisan folks in our governmental structure and these private platforms is. But in some sense, what we have is a new version of the revolving door, right? So the traditional revolving door, as it is used to describe governmental corruption, involves people who who step out of industry and into government for some number of years and then return to industry. That would be the classic pattern. And of course, it functions as some kind of a legal bribing mechanism, because the person, knowing that they've come from an industry, knows what the industry wants, knowing that they will return there, they do the industry's bidding. And the point is, no fingerprints. Another way this can work is industry can approach somebody in government, persuade them, hey, when you come out, why don't you look us up, see if there's a job that we might have for you.
Yep.
It's another mechanism. But then this version with Twitter and Facebook and presumably Google has a different spin to it, right? It works in a different direction. That in effect, instead of going into government to do industry's bidding, these are people from a partisan faction of government who go into industry, right, to do the party's bidding. And so it's a different revolving door, a fundamentally different revolving door.
But it's no less influence peddling.
Well, that's just the thing. So if we can step back, and of course, this is a heck of a week to be discussing influence peddling, but what we've got is a party which is not supposed to have a product, right? Parties are supposed to represent people like me, lifetime Democrat. You as well, lifetime Democrat. We are the Democratic Party. But the Democratic Party is run by the DNC, which is, as I've been saying throughout the period of unity, an influence peddling operation, pure and simple. Now, that influence peddling operation has to acquire power, for which it needs votes. And then what it does with that power is it peddles it, right? So to the extent that voters stop electing the Democratic Party, it has nothing to monetize. It can't sell its influence. And so it must maintain that influence. It must win voters. How do you do that? Well, you've got to control the conversation, because if people were to understand what's actually driving policy, they would throw the bums out. So how do you control the discussion? Well, the discussion is taking place on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, who knows where else. So the point is, the revolving door now has to be in the places where the bounds of polite conversation are set in a private context, so there is no First Amendment protection, and we are left with the results. And what does it look like? Well, frankly, it looks like what Twitter did with the Hunter Biden story, right? Twitter actually shut down the account of the New York Post, a 200-year-old newspaper, and made it impossible to share in a normal sense the article in which the obvious influence peddling going on in the Biden family was made plain. There's no justification for this. Obviously, the voters have a right to understand that one of the major party candidates has a son who was peddling his influence when he was vice president, and they are entitled to extrapolate that might characterize a Biden administration too. And this is, of course, deeply connected to recent history because it was, the Ukrainian connection and the allegation of influence peddling that caused the president to, yes, I believe he abused his power trying to get Biden's son investigated in Ukraine, which triggered an impeachment. This is the most important business of the nation. Here you have real revelations that appear to be robust on the basis of evidence, right? Evidence from Hunter Biden's own computer. And we are being told that information is so suspect that even though published in a major American paper, it cannot be shared. We're not even allowed to see it and decide whether it makes sense to us. So we are now being infantilized and lied to, and having our right to decide, actually, I do want to discuss that, overridden by, it's not the nanny state, it's the nanny corporations. So, the whole thing is absolutely frightening. And, I have to point out that the motivation for the Unity 2020 plan was that we were faced with essentially an influence peddling operation on the Democratic side and a different version of abuse of power on the Republican side, and that it was the system that caused this sort of breakdown that left people frozen out of governmental power, which has made them frustrated and angry and is causing them to lash out in the streets. And essentially, we have to confront the mechanism that generates this failure, or it's going to take the republic apart. And we're seeing it. We're seeing it all laid bare. We're looking at the corruption. We're understanding how it functions. We're seeing that it actually is, it is affecting the way we are able to collectively think by basically deciding not to pass certain messages. Remember, the Unity 2020 Twitter account was suspended for registering phony accounts in order to boost a hashtag, and it didn't register phony accounts.
Which it did not do.
We didn't do it. So
it was suspended for an infraction which it did not engage in.
And it remains suspended. And it is true even this week that if you attempt to DM somebody a link to our website in which we discuss governmental corruption, it's a very odd behavior. You try to DM somebody, and on your side, it looks like you've succeeded in doing it. On their side, it's hidden. Right? It's a very bizarre, nefarious way of controlling what thoughts. Think about it this way.
So you said it's not the nanny state, it's nanny corporations. And there's something important here, and it's not quite right, because censorship, we do censor what children are allowed to experience, right? And so if we can take the connotation of nanny out of it, like, who gets in loco parentis, who gets to take on the status of sort of parenting the populace? To some degree, we as liberals really truly believe that, given especially the global nature of some things like social media, like a lot of technology, we need regulation that actually does protect the populace from some of the things that cannot be regulated by individuals or cities or state level, right? State as opposed to nation or more. But censorship is something that has always been a part of human life. And here we have a sort of imprimatur of from what? From the corporations that are actually allowing us to speak with one another, that is deciding when and what we are allowed to hear and with whom we're allowed to speak. Whereas in the past, what the state was protecting us from with regard to corporations was often corporations basically doing sort of, psyops on us and advertising such that we would not engage our best interest and become our best selves. So there's some mess here that it's not quite so it's not clean. I don't think you meant to suggest that it was clean, that it's moved from sort of nanny state to nanny corporation. That there's censorship, that there's still attempt to create motivations in people that serve the corporation rather than the person. And maybe part of what you're seeing and saying here is that now we have corporations working on behalf of particular political parties who want to change the motivations of people, even when that is not in their best interest and it is only in the interest of, in this case, the DNC.
Well, I think there are two things there. Yes, it is not the people, the nanny, the reference nanny is about an adult who is empowered to tell you no, presumably to protect you from your own worst instincts as a child.
Right.
And so being infantilized by government that wants to protect us against our own instincts is bad enough when it actually happens. Now, the term nanny state is often used to dismiss regulation that is about preventing real harm that can't be prevented in other ways. But it is also true that we see overreach. But the thing is, as Americans, the values encoded in the First Amendment, whether the First Amendment should in some way be extended to or something else should come to protect us online. I mean, and I would remind you, Twitter, Facebook, Google, these are private concerns, but they are on public roads. I mean, the internet started as DARPANet, right? This was our governmental structure generating a mechanism that then created an opportunity for these private concerns. But it's not a simple matter of, hey, they're private, they can do what they want, because effectively we don't have a public access to this internet that we built, right? So it's one of these things where there's at the very least a gray area, as it is with research, where the public funds the research and the product of it is private.